If laws were written with common sense in mind, well, this list wouldn't exist, but here we are. Somewhere out there, you can still ask for a trial by combat. In Oklahoma, men have been hit with child support after their exes used sperm donors. Oh, and if you think everything about a presidential election is airtight, well, wait until you hear what happens when a candidate dies mid-race. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 legal loopholes that defy common sense. But before we get rolling, give the algorithm a nudge. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next one. With that all out of the way, let's go. 25. When death doesn't end a campaign. If a presidential candidate dies after ballots are printed but before the general election or the electoral college votes, there's no clear national rulebook on what to do. The Constitution is very specific about what happens if a president dies after inauguration, but it says nothing about that stretch between Election Day and swearing in. Instead, it's up to state laws and party rules. Some states allow the party to name a replacement. Others leave the deceased candidate on the ballot with no option to reprint. The closest we've ever come to finding out was in 1872 when Horace Greeley lost the election to Ulysses S. Grant. He wasn't president-elect, but after his death, his 66 pledged electors had no clue what to do. Some voted for him anyway. Others backed his running mate, and a few went completely off script. In the end, Congress tossed out the ballots cast for Greeley. To this day, there's still no clear plan if something like that happens again. 24. Human-animal hybrids. In 2021, a research team in California created something straight out of science fiction: human-monkey embryos. They injected human stem cells into macaque embryos and let them grow for almost 3 weeks. The idea was to test whether animals could one day be used to grow human-compatible organs. Now, you'd expect a hard legal line against that, but here in the US, there isn't one. The NIH refuses to fund chimera experiments, but that's just a budget rule. Private labs with private funding? They can keep going. Most states don't even mention hybrids in their laws, and the few that do only have vague limits on embryo or stem cell research. 23. Driverless cars running wild. Arizona used to sell itself as the perfect playground for self-driving cars. Open roads, sunshine almost year-round, and a government that didn't bother weighing companies down with regulations. Uber, Waymo, and anyone else working on autonomous vehicles rushed in. Then came 2018. An Uber test car in Tempe struck and killed a pedestrian. It was the first death tied directly to a fully autonomous system, and it was made worse by the lack of structure surrounding the whole thing. The backup driver in the seat was watching Hulu on their phone, and Uber had turned off the car's emergency braking system to smooth out the ride. By the time the state scrambled to develop the rules, the damage had already been done. 22. California's blind spot. In the late 90s, a woman in Southern California found her life hijacked by her ex-boyfriend who decided to use the internet as his weapon. He set up fake profiles, posted her address and phone number in adult chat rooms, and lured men to her house expecting sex. Each knock on the door made things worse for her, and yet, when she turned to the police, there was nothing they could do. Back then, there were no established online harassment laws. It wasn't until 1999 that California became the first state to explicitly criminalize cyberstalking. Her ordeal ended up becoming one of the first cases to show how unprepared the law was for the digital age. By 1999, California finally revised its criminal code, and cyberstalking and internet harassment became punishable by law. 21. Underage drinking is legal with a parent in Wisconsin. Okay, I don't know how you feel about underage drinking. Here in the US, the legal age is locked at 21. In some places like the UK, it's 18. Then again, there are countries where sipping wine as a teenager is completely normal. In Wisconsin, however, state law actually allows a parent or legal guardian to buy alcohol at a bar or restaurant and hand it to their underage child, even if they're as young as 16 or 17. The only catch is that the parent has to be right there and be the one physically giving the drink. But hosting an underage drinking party is still legal, so it's not some free-for-all at home. And local policies can be stricter than the state's baseline, which is why the experience can change from one town to the next. 20. Moving trains. Still on the subject of booze, the UK has a strange carve-out in its licensing laws. You normally need a license to sell alcohol, no exceptions. But if the sale happens to be on a moving train, that requirement disappears. In 2018, a Yorkshire gin startup called Taplin and Mageean spotted that little detail while waiting on their own license. Instead of sitting around, they rented a vintage steam train, poured drinks for paying guests, and turned the ride into a rolling gin masterclass. Because the train was technically engaged on a journey, every sale was legal, even though their license hadn't cleared yet. It wasn't a long-term plan, but it worked like a charm. The distillery used the loophole to build buzz, sell bottles, and keep money flowing until the paperwork came through. 19. Shark spining in Costa Rica. Costa Rica outlawed shark finning back in 2005, but the way the law was written left a hole big enough to sail a boat through. It states that if you get caught with a shark fin, dead shark, or carcass, the fin has to be naturally attached to the shark's body. In 2011, seafood dealer Kathy Tsang used that to her advantage. She stripped sharks down to their bare spines, but left the fins dangling by a strip of skin and claimed that it technically counted as a body. A judge sided with her and even ordered the government to pay her for the seized fins. Carcasses with spines and fins still show up at the docks, so the problem is far from over. 18. Trial by combat. Trial by combat was once a legitimate part of British common law. If two people couldn't resolve a dispute, they could literally fight it out, and the winner's claim stood. Parliament finally abolished the practice in 1819, but by then the American colonies had already inherited the tradition. The US Constitution never mentioned it, and it was never formally outlawed. That gap gave some legal commentators an odd argument. Under the Ninth Amendment, rights not taken away are technically retained, so in theory, a litigant could demand a duel. Most judges laugh the idea off, but it has been tested. In 2016, New York attorney Richard Luthman asked a court to settle his case by trial by combat, even referencing Game of Thrones for effect. His request was denied. 17. Discretion and charge stacking. Al Capone wasn't taken down for murder, racketeering, or the empire of crime he built in Chicago. Prosecutors nailed him on tax evasion. That's the kind of flexibility built into the US justice system. Prosecutors can decide which charges to bring, and sometimes they'll reach for the ones that are easier to prove rather than the ones that match the crime scale. Other times they go in the opposite direction, stacking dozens of overlapping charges to box a defendant into a plea deal. It's not a loophole in the text of the law, but in practice, it creates one. Some criminals slip through untouched, others get hammered with charges for the same act, and it all depends on how a prosecutor decides to play it. 16. Crimes without punishment. Have you ever heard of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations? It's the international agreement that gives foreign diplomats protection from local laws in the countries where they serve. In theory, it's there to prevent harassment or political retaliation. But in practice, it sometimes produces absurd results. Take parking tickets, for example. In New York City, UN diplomats have piled up roughly $16 million in unpaid fines over the years. And there are far more troubling cases. In 1997, a Georgian diplomat killed a Washington teenager while driving drunk. It was only after Georgia waived his immunity that he was able to be tried in a U.S. court. The system is designed to protect diplomacy, but it can just as easily let people escape justice. 15. The Century-Old Cutoff. Federal gun law has drawn a strange line in the sand. If a firearm was made before 1899, it isn't legally considered a firearm. The result is almost surreal. It means that a revolver built in 1898 can be bought and shipped across state lines without a federal background check, the same way you might order a piece of vintage furniture. Collectors deal in rifles, pistols, and even black powder cannons, and the law treats them as curios rather than weapons. Replicas or antiques that have been modified to fire modern ammunition don't get the same treatment, but the cutoff still means that there are plenty of fully functional 19th century guns moving freely on the market. 14. Non-natives and tribal law. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that tribal courts can't prosecute non-Indians, in plain terms, people who aren't Native American, for crimes on tribal land. That decision left a major gap. If a non-native commits a crime against a native person on tribal land, the case usually falls to federal or state prosecutors, not the tribe. And when those outside prosecutors decline to pursue charges, the crime often goes unpunished. It's a fact that Native American women experience some of the highest rates of sexual violence in the country. Much of it is committed by non-native men. So in 2013, Congress responded by amending the Violence Against Women Act to give tribes authority to prosecute certain domestic and dating violence cases involving non-native defendants. That was progress, but it didn't cover everything. To give you an idea, sexual assault by strangers, child abuse, and many other crimes still fell outside tribal authority. The 2022 reauthorization expanded that jurisdiction to more offenses, but some gaps still remain. 13. The Supreme Court has, until recently, had no enforceable ethics code. Until very recently, Supreme Court justices were the only judges in America without a binding ethics code. Every lower court judge follows strict rules, but the 9 at the top relied on an honor system. That meant gifts, trips, and conflicts of interest were left to each justice's discretion. The problem came into focus when reports showed Justice Clarence Thomas accepted luxury vacations, private jet flights, and other benefits from billionaire Harlan Crow, perks worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that went undisclosed for years. The court finally adopted a code of conduct in November 2023. But the rules are still self-policed, with no outside body to investigate or sanction violations. 12. Congress can legally trade stocks using insider knowledge. The Stock Act of 2012 was billed as a safeguard against insider trading on Capitol Hill. What it really did was require lawmakers to disclose their trades, with fines as low as $200 for missing a deadline. No one has ever been prosecuted under it. That's why members of Congress have continued to buy and sell stocks in industries they oversee, sometimes right after closed-door briefings. In fact, during the early days of the pandemic, several well-timed trades raised eyebrows but led to nothing. The law technically forbids insider trading, yet proving it is nearly impossible. 11. No law against child marriage in New Hampshire. Until 2018. Before fairly recent changes, New Hampshire law still allowed children to marry. Girls as young as 13 and boys as young as 14 could wed if a parent signed off and a judge approved. Hundreds of minors were married under that system between the mid-90s and early 2010s. And while that fact alone might raise a few eyebrows, the craziest part is that when reformers pushed to raise the age to 18, lawmakers initially pushed back. Early proposals to ban child marriage failed, with some legislators arguing it was unnecessary. That only changed after mounting public pressure and national attention made the loophole impossible to ignore. Lawmakers raised the minimum age to 16 in 2018, and then finally to 18 in 2023, with the law taking effect on January 1st, 2025. 10. Cruise lines and taxes. Cruise lines often dodge a lot of their tax burdens by registering their ships under what's called a flag of convenience. That means a ship built, owned, and operating in one country may legally fly the flag of another, usually Panama, Liberia, or the Bahamas, where taxes, labor rules, and safety regulations are far more relaxed. Under U.S. law, there's also Section 883, which gives cruise and shipping companies in foreign jurisdictions a way to avoid federal income tax on what counts as international shipping income, provided they meet certain ownership and registration criteria, which means that these companies can pay minimal corporate tax rates hire crews at extremely low wages, and avoid the typical regulatory oversight that stricter home countries might enforce. 9. Fleeing to a country with no extradition. When fugitives can get out of the US, some try to game the system by heading to countries that won't send them back. The best-known case is the filmmaker Roman Polanski. He fled in 1978 before sentencing in a sexual abuse case and has avoided return ever since. As a French citizen, he benefits from France's policy of generally not extraditing its own nationals. Poland's courts also refused to hand him over, and even when Swiss police briefly detained him in 2009, the extradition bid collapsed. He's far from the only one. People facing US charges sometimes seek out countries with no extradition treaty at all, or ones that build in protections for their own citizens. That doesn't mean fugitives can travel freely, step into the wrong country, and the arrest warrant can catch up, but it does mean that some can live openly abroad for years while American courts wait. 8. Prison labor. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States, but it came with a built-in exception. The text bans slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. That single clause left the door open for compulsory prison labor, and states wasted no time using it. After the Civil War, southern states passed vague laws that criminalized vagrancy and other minor offenses, then leased out inmates to farms, railroads, and mines. It was a profitable system, but it mirrored slavery in practice. Today, the setup continues, but in a more regulated form. Inmates across the country are required to work jobs like cooking, laundry, or manufacturing, and should they refuse work, they can face disciplinary punishment. 7. Stacking codes for 5-star stays. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, online booking sites were still figuring out how to handle global traffic, and some sharp-eyed travelers found the cracks. Sites like Orbitz and Expedia rolled out regional branches with generous promo codes, but the system didn't always check for stacking errors, meaning multiple discounts could be applied at once. Add in a mid-checkout currency switch that sometimes miscalculated exchange rates, and the price of a luxury hotel room could collapse to pocket change. Travel forums lit up with step-by-step guides, and people bragged about catching 5-star stays for the cost of a fast food meal. The rush didn't last long, though. As soon as hotels saw that their suites were filling up with bargain hunters, reservations were canceled, promo codes were blocked, and the loopholes got patched. 6. Unlimited presidential pardon power. The president can pardon almost any federal crime. The Constitution only gives us one exemption: impeachment, and that leaves the rest wide open. That's why Gerald Ford could wipe Richard Nixon's record clean in 1974, to name but one of the more controversial ones. The biggest unanswered question is whether a president could pardon himself. No one has ever tried, and legal experts are divided over it. The Justice Department once argued it would break the principle that no person should judge their own case, but because it's never been tested, it's still on the table. In recent years, members of Congress have come aboard to rein in this power, especially when pardons look like rewards for allies. For now, the pardon remains one of the most powerful tools in Washington. 5. Evidence obtained illegally must be thrown out. Under what's called the exclusionary rule, evidence collected in violation of the Constitution usually can't be used in court. That means, if a police officer breaks into a home without a valid search warrant and finds drugs or a weapon, a judge will most likely toss that evidence. Without it, prosecutors might have no case, and the defendant can walk. The same principle applies to statements. If officers fail to give Miranda warnings before an interrogation, any confession that follows is usually off the table. The regulation exists to discourage misconduct by law enforcement, but the side effect is that guilty people sometimes go free. 4. There used to be no law covering artificial insemination in Oklahoma divorce cases. Until 2020, Oklahoma's family code had almost nothing to say about artificial insemination or surrogacy. The only statutes on the books dated back to the 60s, when lawmakers assumed pregnancy always happened between a husband and wife. So in practice, when disputes arose in divorce cases, judges often had to stretch old rules. In 2016, for instance, a husband argued he shouldn't be legally responsible for a child conceived with donor sperm during the marriage since he never consented. In this case, the court still held him liable because the law presumed any child born in a marriage belonged to the husband, no matter the circumstances. The confusion lasted until Oklahoma passed House Bill 2468. The law finally created the framework for assisted reproduction and surrogacy, requiring written agreements, consent, and court approval. 3. Massachusetts and same-sex marriages. When same-sex couples challenged Massachusetts law in the early 2000s for the right to marry and have their unions legally recognized, most people thought it wouldn't work. Marriage had always been treated as a man and woman institution. But when the state's highest court looked at the actual statutes, they uncovered something important. The laws never spelled that out. The language only referred to persons or spouses with no mention of gender. That omission became central in Goodridge v. Department of Health in 2003. The Supreme Judicial Court ruled that denying licenses to same-sex couples violated the state constitution, and without gender-specific wording in the statutes, its opponents had little ground to stand on. The ruling made Massachusetts the first U.S. state to legalize same-sex marriage, and others soon followed suit. 2. Gambling in Japan. Japan wins the cheeky loophole game. On paper, gambling is against the law, but pachinko parlors have turned that rule inside out with one of the most famous workarounds in the world. The setup is simple. Instead of placing bets with money, players buy little steel balls and feed them into pachinko machines. Win enough, and you trade those balls for special prizes inside the parlor. Then, just outside, at a technically separate business, those prizes can be sold for cash. Because the parlor isn't the one handing you money, regulators don't classify pachinko as gambling, even though the whole system is designed to work exactly like it. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry with thousands of parlors across the country. 1. When it comes to religious headgear. Last but not least, let's end this list on a more light-hearted note. Most states have rules about showing your face in ID photos, but they do have exceptions when it comes to religious headgear. That makes sense for turbans, hijabs, or yarmulkes, and I totally wear my yarmulke right now, but I can't find it. But the wording has been broad enough for a few jokers to test the limits. In Massachusetts, a self-proclaimed Pastafarian, part of the satirical Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, insisted her faith required her to wear a metal colander on her head. The RMV denied her request at first, but after she appealed with support from the American Humanists Association, the state caved. She ended up walking away with a driver's license photo featuring a pasta strainer as her religious symbol. And with that, it's a wrap. But before you go, you have to answer this trivia question. Al Capone wasn't brought down for murder or racketeering. What crime actually sent him to prison? Was it A, mail fraud, B, tax evasion, C, jury tampering, or D, extortion? Drop your answer in the comments below. And since you clearly love loopholes, you should check out our related video, 25 clever loopholes that forced companies to rewrite the rules. That one is loaded with people that game the system so hard, companies had to rewrite the book. That video's link will show up right here in just a few seconds. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. I truly appreciate and love you all. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next time. Gonna go do a barrel roll. Fox.